Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to the webinar on, sorry, I'm just adjusting my camera because I've realised I can see the top of my laptop in my camera. There we go, that's better. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on probationary periods. The webinar will cover a variety of different parts of probationary periods, and we'll talk specifically, I guess, about my views and opinions. There are obviously other views and opinions out there that will differ from mine across the HR community. And then I will open the call up at the end for questions and answers, but we'll press pause on the recording at that point so that what we get is a nice helpful video that people can refer back to if they want. So why did I pick the subject of probationary periods? So at the back end of last year, I had a number of clients who contacted me on the run up to Christmas, which what felt like quite crisis type calls. So there was issues with people in their team that they wanted to deal with, who'd been with them for short periods of time, and actually they sort of already made the decision that they wanted to part company with those people. And of course, then when we asked the question about probationary period, every single one of these people had missed the probationary period window. So the employer had missed the opportunity to have those conversations and therefore had to go through a more complicated, more difficult process for them, and a fairly unsatisfactory process for the individuals to help them part company and go in different directions. And it just became really obvious that although all my clients have a probationary period written into their contracts of employment with their employees, they're not using them. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to just refresh us on why they're there, how they can be helpful, but also then tip it on its head and look at it from an employee's point of view, because you get really different feedback from people within the HR community on whether they love or they hate probationary periods and probationary reviews. So I thought it would be useful to go through that and maybe talk about, is there some new ways or some different ways that we can approach probationary periods? So why do we have a probationary period? So there are a number of processes in our handbook that allow us to exit somebody out of the company. And my first experience of probationary period was always using the probationary period as a safety net. So a way to shortcut the company processes to exit somebody quickly. So you recruited somebody, they weren't the right skills, they weren't fit for purpose, they weren't a good fit in whatever way possible, and the company would make a decision to exit them quickly, and they'd use the probationary period to do that, so they didn't have to go through some sort of disciplinary or performance improvement plan. So it was very much a shortcut, and they were probably my first experiences of probationary periods. Now, as an employee, that's a pretty horrible process to go through. So you're coming to work every day, you're settling in with a new team and a new organisation, and someone can literally sit you down on the day and say, we don't think it's working out, we're going to terminate your employment under the probationary review process. Thank you very much. And you may or may not get a short amount of notice or a payment in lieu of notice, or you might get almost nothing. And as I say, it's a quick way for an employer to get rid of somebody, but it's a fairly unsatisfactory process for an employee. And I imagine in the current environment, where we've got lots of other factors going on, such as the employment market, such as a lot of mental health issues, people still recovering from the impact of COVID, that actually that could be a real confidence knock for somebody, especially somebody maybe earlier in their career. And could have a really lasting impact on them. So it was frustrating to hear that, but again, I understand that employers have the right to exercise to protect their business. So we've got this balance, and this balance is a constant thing we find between making good quality decisions to protect the business, but also to create a culture and environment that employees want to work in. So we've got this constant balance. So are there some other ways in which we can approach the probationary period? Oh, sorry, I wanted to mention as well. One of the things I've noticed recently about dismissal under probationary period and probation reviews is that there was a case in the news a few weeks ago, and it was Richardson versus James Fisher Nuclear. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. So what they did is they exercised their right to terminate somebody within their probationary period. So didn't go through the normal full process, don't have to explain themselves in a great deal of detail. So this lady joined the company, was in probationary period, and they terminated her employment around performance issues. They didn't think she was a good fit for the company. In that period, they'd also found out that she was pregnant. And so she brought them to tribunal for unfair dismissal related to her pregnancy and to discrimination. Now, the tribunal actually found that in that case, and it's quite a complex case, so you do need to read the case summary in more detail, but that they found that there was enough legal breaches that they made an award of £185,000 to the employer. So not a insignificant amount of money to go to tribunal for what they probably thought was a fairly straightforward termination at the time. So there are definitely some pitfalls and some warnings that come with that a probationary termination is still not without its flaws and could still attract a level of risk to you, especially around protected characteristics. So again, you need to be really careful about going into your probation reviews and thinking about things like those protected characteristics. Or as I say, in this case, the fact that this lady was pregnant. So one of the things I really encourage my employers to do when I work with them is to maximize the use of the probation review. And this is part of a larger set of processes. So this is part of our creating a healthy, balanced culture for a workforce. So the relationship starts back in the recruitment process. And what I've found is that when the recruitment process doesn't go very well, or when it's been done quickly or been done without sort of due care and attention, the probationary review is used like a safety net. It's like a get out of jail card for the fact that you've done a crap job in your recruitment process to start with. So obviously, if you do a good quality job on your recruitment process, then it's less likely you're going to need to exercise that probationary review, because you'll catch some of those concerns within your recruitment process if you do a good quality process. So that's the first thing, is I'd go back to earlier processes and check that they do complement what you're trying to achieve, which is this healthy, balanced workforce of motivated employees. So I would definitely go back and spend some more good quality time on your selection criteria, your attraction campaigns, in terms of generating the right candidates. And that's really difficult in the current market. But actually, would you rather have two really good quality candidates that you know actually are going to stay with you for a long period in time than end up making a rush decision, taking on not quite the right candidate who turns out to be a poor fit for the company, or comes with skills that you thought you could train and not be able to train them, or performance issues that then you have to dismiss through your probationary period, which obviously that's a huge amount of money wasted and time wasted in terms of you getting to that part in the process. So I would definitely go back and review your recruitment and selection process, and obviously the start of your onboarding process. So then when somebody starts, I would be talking to them already about expectations within the company as part of your onboarding process. So I'm not talking about setting loads of objectives when somebody's just started and doesn't know where the toilets and the kitchens are, but actually it's about talking maybe about standards of behavior or standards of work, talking about the culture of the organization, But there may be within the first week or two some really clear things that either that person does need to deliver on or does need to start picking up, whether that's training, whether that's getting the hang of company systems. You should have some small goals for them, because one, it helps settle them into the organization, and two, it helps them to feel motivated and connected. And so then you can see, you know, how people work. You can see who are the people quite self-motivated, that'll get on with it on their own without a lot of support. You'll see those people that might need a bit more coaching or nurturing or a little bit more support generally, in terms of then moving through those first few weeks of settling in. And by using some very simple goal setting or some very simple high level targets, even one or two things. So it might be something as simple as, in the first week, I'd encourage you to talk to 5 people from 5 different departments and just go and find out a little bit more about how the business works. So it might be a goal that's as simple as that. And then the following week, you just check in with that person and say, how did you get on with that? Did you do it? You know, how did you find it? Did it work? What did you learn? So you're doing constant, very gentle reviews with them. And I then encourage that cycle continues. So it doesn't become a big, arduous admin appraisal type task. It's small, manageable steps for that person, depending, you know, on the where they are in the career, you know, the level of the role, but you know, straightforward activities that they should be able to pick up and move with. It should also flag to you then if you need to give them support, either as their manager or as their HR person. And that will allow you then much quicker to understand whether you've got an issue or not, and whether then you may need to exercise that probationary period. But also, if you're having a weekly conversation with somebody who hasn't picked up the targets, hasn't understood the level of contribution expected for them, then hopefully if you do get to a probation review and it does look like you're going to terminate, that shouldn't be a huge surprise to the individual if you've had those small conversations building up to that. So very much more, it becomes like a cumulative process. It shouldn't be, I started on day 1 and 3 months in, on my final day of my probationary period, I have a meeting where I'm dismissed. That's a massive surprise to me. It definitely shouldn't feel like that. So some sort of regular objective setting, cumulative process, as I say, very straightforward. They don't even have to be work related, the goals. They could just be goals to do with settling into the organization, starting to understand some basic systems. So really small goals. The other thing I would say is the probationary period is a two-way process. And I know a lot of people see it very much as the power sits with the employer, because the employer can make that decision to terminate. But I would say that actually in the current market, where we've got very low rates of unemployment, we have very high rates of recruitment at the moment, and staff turnover is moving. And I think some of the things that are going on around it, maybe in social media, in terms of the different generational expectations, I think there are more people coming into employment now in their early 20s who actually they're exercising their rights around the probationary period, which is, in the probationary period, the notice periods tend to be much shorter. So it could be a week, for instance. And so you may find now that as an employer, you are on probation as well, which is something that we probably haven't seen in practice a great deal, but we are starting to see more and more people do, where they join a company with expectations. Maybe the job's been oversold by an agency or oversold by the employer themselves, or they haven't maybe explained the size or scope of the role. Maybe they thought they were going to get to do hybrid working and home working, and then the realism is it's a presentee environment, and so they're expected to be in the office all the time. And in some way their expectations haven't been met, or the culture just doesn't feel right for them when they get there, or even there's just another opportunity that comes out within those timescales. you will now find an employee, especially those younger employees with maybe that haven't got the same financial commitments and can be more flexible in their decision making, actually saying, no, you failed the probation, no, I'm actually going to resign and go somewhere else, and I can give you a week's notice. So we are starting to see more and more people exercising their right within that probationary period around those notice periods. And that's really interesting, because I think employers have forgotten that it is a two-way process, that the power doesn't all sit with them. And I think as resources limited and critical to a lot of businesses, that becomes really, really important. I also think that coming into a new employer, and I see this a lot, I have a slightly different personal view on this, but I see this a lot in the HR groups. Some HR people have just scrapped probationary periods entirely, and that's because that uncertainty for an employee in those first number of months is seen to be unhelpful and unrealistic. It means that people don't quite engage fully with the employer, and so some companies have gone as far as to scrap probationary periods. But for me, that might be a step too far, because I think I like to go back to this idea of we're always balancing between the employer and the employee, but I do think the process needs to change somewhat. So what would we include within a good quality probationary process? So as I say, for me, the first thing is to go outside the process. So get your recruitment right, get your recruitment into good shape. If you work with agencies, don't overscope and oversell the job. I constantly, and I don't do a lot of recruitment, it is not my area of expertise, but I do quite often find myself supporting interview processes with employers. And what I often say is, in your interview process, do not sell the glossy magazine version of your company, because when they join, that person's going to be massively disappointed. So I would always encourage employers to be really honest about what the job entails. So if the job does entail a large amount of overtime or weekend working, or there is an administrative task that is not seen to be that pleasant and maybe needs some work around it, or I don't know, there just is, for me, if you said come and do a HR job with lots of recruitment, that would be the bit that would put me off. But I think then what you'd get is the person that you got for the job would be the right person. It would be somebody that likes doing those activities. And it's much easier then for that person to join and understand their contribution and understand the company and the organization. So if there are things not quite right, and there are, most of us, there are parts of our job that are not quite as pleasant to do as some of the nice bits, then say that, explain that, and balance it off then with those positives. So definitely get your recruitment process right. As I say, then next, start with your onboarding. So really think about how you get people into the company. Again, setting those expectations, creating an environment that they want to work in, creating the right level of support for people. And alongside that, think about your contracts of employment and your wording in your contracts of employment. So do we talk about the probationary period being a mutual probationary period, or do we talk about it just in terms of how the employer has power and the employee doesn't? So definitely think about your wording around that. As I say, from day one, set those clear objectives, those clear expectations, targets, whatever they might be. As I say, don't make them big or complicated, make them reasonably achievable. But then remember to actually follow them up, and that's really important. So if you asked somebody to do 3 things, how did they get on? And was there anything that you could have done better as their manager or their HR person to help facilitate that? So I would then say hold regular reviews. That employee wants feedback. They want to know how they're doing. Am I doing okay? Am I doing this right? You know, have I understood this correctly? That's really important. That can keep an employee really, really motivated or really demotivated. So if there's just no feedback, that can be really difficult. And also, it's very hard to correct action if you don't know about it. So quite often, in lots of cases in retained HR, what I see is things that could have been nipped in the bud at a conversation at 2 weeks that didn't happen, and has become an acceptable habit when you're 12 weeks in. And so it's much harder then to then say, well, we're dismissing you for something, when you know that person's been doing it from day one, but you've never had a conversation with them about it. So you've never given them the opportunity to say, oh, I didn't realize that's not what you wanted, and I can adjust my behavior, I can adjust my performance. With some help, I can learn those skills. So definitely hold regular conversations. And again, they don't need to be really, really formal. There doesn't need to be masses of notes. You might just want to put, a note in your diary saying you had a conversation. And if you have a notebook, I was talking to someone earlier about the fact I still like paper and pen, but you might just want to make some notes of if there was something in particular you committed to or they committed to, having those notes down. Some businesses will have much bigger systems. They'll have something that works automated as part of their HR system. I know some of the HR systems do have some sort of regular review cycle, and maybe you can help that, if nothing else, to prompt you, to remind you or your managers to do that. So, as I've already said, make sure you raise any performance issues early, no matter how small they are. Pick them up quickly. Raise behavioural issues early, pick them up quickly. I had an incident before Christmas where 2 employees of the company had a disagreement about a piece of work. And obviously they both knew that it was unacceptable to have an argument in the office. So what they did is they went and stood on the pavement outside the building and shouted at each other on the pavement outside the building. So they knew there was a standard, and they thought that that was a way of they could deal with it. Now, what happened then was actually the behaviours of one of those people who was in the probationary period. It had been showing up since very early on in their performance and in their interaction with another team. And rather than anyone actually speaking directly to that person, they let it escalate into something like that looked like very much like an argument outside an office building, and then decided to dismiss that person. Now, what the outcome might still have been a dismissal in the probationary period, but actually, could they have solved that earlier? Possibly. Could they have tackled that earlier? Definitely. Would they potentially not have had to do some sort of level of investigation? Absolutely, yes. So I think preempting this stuff, nipping it in the bud, getting there early is really, really important. One of the other things I would ask for, and again, this is about balance, is we quite often only take the view of one person, so the manager deciding around the individual. Now, I've worked in teams where I've seen my team's performance on a day-to-day basis. So I am in a good position to make an assessment, and a fair assessment, about their performance. But I've also worked with teams where their clients are based somewhere else on site. So therefore, I don't see them every day. We now have a lot of teams who are doing hybrid working from home. So again, their performance isn't that visible to me. So actually, am I best placed to make a decision about that person's performance? Possibly not. So I would say as well, go and get feedback from other people. If your team do customer services, if they provide a service to a third party, go and ask for feedback in terms of their performance. Ask how this is going. Ask if you see any room for improvement. And also make sure you understand what they've been trained in and not trained in case the performance issue is actually a result of something you've not explained to them or they've not yet understood about the business. The next thing for me would be work within the timescales that you've set, but don't leave it to the last minute. So if you have a 3-month probationary period, work within those 3 months, but don't do nothing until the end of the 3 months. Take regular steps of activity throughout the period is what I would say. Now, the next thing I would say is, if someone is going to fail their probationary period, so if it's relatively clear at a point that the right decision for the business is to exit that person, just again think about how you do that, and think about the meeting itself and the impact you are having on that person. And this for me is bigger than your employment relationship with this person. This is about being a responsible employer. It's also about protecting your brand. It's about other employees seeing how you behave in these set of circumstances. So all your other new starters are watching you carefully to see how you behave. It's also about having an impact on that individual outside of that work environment. So think really carefully about that process that you're going to take them through, not just the fact that you're about to have a really uncomfortable conversation with somebody and terminate their employment, but actually that the long-term impact on it. So, and the support and the feedback that you might provide them with, so that if nothing else, when they go into their next employment, the experience will still be unpleasant. They've still lost their job through the process, but maybe they've had some learning through it. So it might be something behavioural or performance related, something they can take responsibility for to improve or tackle differently as they go into a new employer. So I would definitely think about that build up, so they're getting regular feedback, so it's much less likely to be a surprise if you are terminating their employment, but also then thinking about how you handle that exit out. Now, in my case, most of the employees I work with who have had to terminate within a probationary period would terminate with immediate effect, and will terminate with immediate effect and then pay in lieu of any notice they've got owed. I have one employer that always pays more than the probationary period, because they see in their particular industry the level of impact is quite high, and so they feel that there's giving a little bit of additional financial support is something they've chosen to do, but that's not a legal requirement to go over and above what's in your contract of employment, as long as it's aligned with statutory minimums. So I would definitely think very carefully about the process that you follow to do that and how that feedback is given. The one thing that I am not a fan of, doesn't mean I haven't recommended it in certain circumstances, but I am not a fan of, is extending probationary periods. I think there aren't that many valid reasons for extending a probationary period. I think the only one I sort of experienced recently is we had somebody who was on 3 months probationary period who joined the company. I think they got COVID, I think it was COVID related, and were poorly for like a month of that probationary period. The employer had seen not enough, they felt, within those few weeks that they had been in the company to fairly assess their performance. But what they did is they only extended the probationary period for the period that the employee had been absent, so that they felt that the employee had a fair opportunity to demonstrate their skills, and then the employer had a fair opportunity to see those skills in action. So they only extended it by a month, and they explained to the employee quite a while before the end of the probationary period that that's what they were planning to do. So it wasn't a surprise. But to do that at the end of the 3-month window, for instance, and then extend by another 3 months. So again, you generate that feeling of uncertainty for much longer. That person then might also think, oh, maybe there's a concern, and they've maybe not been honest with me about it. Maybe I'll start looking for a new job as well. So I would be although there's, again, legally you are allowed to, if it says in your contracts or your handbooks that the employer reserves the right to extend probationary periods, then you can do it. But again, I'd want to have a good reason for doing it. I would definitely want to have a very justifiable reason. So there wouldn't be many circumstances where I would actively recommend extending a probationary period. So I think they're the main points in terms of the the probationary periods itself. So as I say, make sure you've got it right in your contracts in terms of if you choose to use them. If you don't use them, then you need to think about all the other places that the probationary period is referenced. So things like your disciplinary processes in particular, or your performance management or your performance improvement processes, they tend to show up in those. Quite often you might see a statement saying, if you have short service, we won't apply the whole process to you. So there'll be a shortened version of the process. So I would say there's lots of opportunities to improve your probationary period and to use your probationary periods better. And I would say alongside all those improvements, if you decide to keep your probationary periods, then I would also really consider thinking about how much time you spend communicating probationary periods and the way they should work to the people involved in the process. So set an expectation with the new employee about what's going to happen. But I would say more importantly, be really clear with your people managers, again, on how they should be using the probationary period, why it's there, what the value is of it, so that they can really make the most of settling that person into the company or picking up quickly that there's a problem. So I hope that's been of help. I am going to pause the video now so that if there's any questions, you can ask questions. If you're watching the webinar as a recording, if you do want to ask any questions, then if you drop an email to hr@pennyjoneshr.com, then again, we'll pick up any messages from you. If we've got any questions, we'll try our best to answer them. So as I say, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please let us know.